All right, now we talk about housing quite a bit on this podcast, and for good reason, because it's so integral to saving money. Housing expenses, whether that's rent or repayments, probably drain the most out of our budgets, possibly more so than ever nowadays, with housing affordability plunging, as we touched on earlier. So, is there anything our politicians can do about it? Well, let's discuss with Shadow Housing Minister Michael Sukkar. Michael, thanks for joining us on the Savings Tip Jar.
Great to be with you. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for joining us, Michael, on a pretty busy day, it looks like. So we'll first discuss probably the most important policy announced recently by the government for our listeners, and that's the government's Help to Buy shared equity scheme. So what are your general thoughts and feelings on that scheme, and where does the opposition sit with it?
Well, look, it's fair to say we're not particularly excited about the scheme, to be frank. I mean, it's a very small scheme. The government's saying that they're making 10,000 places available per year. It was supposed to start on the 1st of January this year, and it's now already 9 months late. So we don't have much detail or information from them. But the policy, in essence, it's a fairly plain and vanilla shared equity scheme where you will own a home with the government, and the government will own up to 40% of that home, so hence the equity component. Look, my honest view is there'll be some Australians who find that as an opportunity to enter the housing market and will be enthusiastic about owning a home with the government. History tells us that most Australians don't view that as something that they aspire to in their lives. There's lots of questions that are unanswered. You know, who carries the repairs and maintenance? If you cease to qualify, for example, if you get a pay rise and all of a sudden your income is above the threshold of the scheme, are you then forced to dispose of the home? And you might be forced to, by the government, to sell your share of the home. A whole lot of questions that aren't answered. So from our perspective, shared equity schemes are very niche, they're very small. Typically a very small number of Australians want to get involved, and we're waiting to see the detail on this. But as I said, it's 9 months late. This government really doesn't talk about first home buyers. If I can give a shameless plug, Harrison and Dominic, I'd say for the people listening to this podcast, they should check out the home guarantee scheme that I put in place when I was housing minister. It helps people buy a home with a deposit of as little as 5%. It's backed by a number of banks. There's a panel of lenders. That's helped more than 100,000 people into their first home. So I personally view that coalition program of the Home Guarantee Scheme much more preferable for most Australians, because in the end, they'll own the home themselves 100%. They won't be sharing it with the government.
Obviously, that home guarantee scheme is still going. The current government has retained that policy, and I guess they've expanded it as well. Obviously, you've got the family home guarantee as well as the regional home guarantee as well. But Michael, I just wanted to ask you about the Housing Australia Future Fund. So for those that don't know, that's the $10 billion that's to be invested. The returns from that $10 billion are to be used to build 30,000 new social and affordable housing properties in the first 5 years of the policy. Now, we've got groups such as Master Builders Australia and the Property Council really wanting this to happen. But I'm just wondering, at a time when people are crying out for affordable housing supply, why is the coalition blocking this policy?
Well, we've not supported it from the start, so we're not blocking it. It's up to the government to get the legislation through, and they've been unable to get the support of the Senate to pass this policy. Look, let's be frank, this was a policy that was cooked up so the government could say, we're investing $10 billion into housing. As you quite rightly prefaced in your remarks, Dominic, it's not $10 billion into housing, it's $10 billion which gets parked with the Future Fund. That costs us about $400 million a year in interest on the borrowing of that $10 billion. Then it probably costs another $100 million on the management fee that the Future Fund charged the Commonwealth. So to borrow that $10 billion and give it to the Future Fund, it's costing Australian taxpayers about $500 million per year. And then there's the hope that that will return in that fund an amount above that $500 million that can then potentially be distributed into social and affordable housing. Our point has been that if a government's going to invest in social and affordable housing, it should do so directly. It should make sure that the investment is predictable, and that's far from the case here with the Housing Australia Future Fund. The other point I'd make, if everything I say occurs and the fund does exceptionally well and it delivers more than $500 million a year in interest that it's going to cost and management fees, and there actually is a distribution to build social and affordable housing, they're seeking to build 6,000 homes per year for the next 5 years. We built more than 6,000 social and affordable homes per year when we were in government, so they're promising to do less. And to be frank, at the same time that they're saying that they are making this bold commitment to build 6,000 homes a year, they're going to be bringing in over that period 1.5 million migrants. So we think it is utterly ridiculous as a policy. If the government's going to invest in housing, they should do so directly. It should be predictable. As I'm sure you and many of your listeners will be aware, had this fund been set up last year, they would have lost money. Not only would there be no money for social and affordable housing, the $10 billion would have gone backwards because the Future Fund shrunk in a tough economic environment. So there's no certainty here for the industry. I don't blame the Master Builders Association or the Property Council saying that they support it, because in the end, they will quite rightly support any potential investment into housing, no matter how small it is. Obviously, as an opposition, we've got to look at these things with a much broader focus. And to be paying $500 million a year in interest and fees on borrowing, our basic point is, why don't you just cut out the middleman, being this future fund, and just spend $500 million a year directly on social affordable housing, which is essentially what you're doing by borrowing the money anyway. The Greens in the Senate happen to agree on that point, and that's why it's not got through. So, look, we think it's a bit of a Ponzi scheme. It's, to be frank, been engineered to make it sound like they're spending $10 billion on housing. You and your listeners who are financially literate know that's not true, but they're hoping for a lot of people out there that they just hear the $10 billion and people make that assumption that they're doing something huge for housing, which we know they're not. So we're not supportive. We haven't supported it from the start, and there will be no circumstances where we support that fund.
Some pretty strong terminology there, Michael, describing it as a Ponzi scheme. And I never thought I'd see the day where the LNP would agree with the Greens on that one. But here we are. But looking back, the LNP
Harrison, our position, we came to our position first, so our position came very clear.
Well, the Greens are coming on and supporting the LNP.
I probably didn't think the Greens would agree with us either, but strange things happen sometimes.
There we go. Yeah. So my next question is, the LNP had 9 years in power, and I think if we look at the sort of rate of, like you mentioned, if you want to increase supply, you got to cut out the middleman and build it yourself. And I think if we look at the rate of public housing to the population, it's actually fallen over the last sort of 30 years or so. So my question is, why now? Why didn't the LNP address that in their 9 years in power?
Well, look, as you would know, predominantly public and social housing is the responsibility of state governments. They're the one who own the stock. They're the ones who manage department housing. So it's really only been a recent phenomenon that the Commonwealth has even got involved in this case, social and affordable housing. And when I was Assistant Minister to the Treasurer, we set up the National Housing Finance Investment Corporation. That's a very proud coalition achievement where we funneled billions of dollars and assisted in bringing down the finance costs for community housing providers. So sadly, you're right. Under predominantly, but not only, state Labor governments, we've seen record low investments into housing. We've seen the wait lists increase across the country. And that was part of the reason why we stepped in for the first time, set up the National Housing Finance Investment Corporation to do what we could do as a federal government. And, to the government's credit, they've taken on MIFIC, they've taken on our home guarantee scheme, they've taken on the First Home Super Saver scheme. In fact, everything that's there to support people into housing is a coalition policy achievement. There's nothing that's been delivered yet by this government, and let's be frank, they're nearly 18 months into their term and we've seen nothing. We've obviously the very small Help to Buy program we've seen promised. When I was housing minister, and today's not just about me crowing about our time in government, but when I was housing minister, we had an absolute laser-like focus on first home buyers, whether it was the home guarantee program, which I established and set up in the first 6 months of the Morrison government in 2019, to the First Home Super Saver scheme, as mentioned, and Home Builder, we directly assisted more than 300,000 people into a first home. A pretty remarkable achievement in 3 years. And now we see, sadly, first home buyers down, new home starts down, dwelling approvals down, rents up. Not all of that is entirely the fault of the government, but we've seen no reaction or response from them to address these problems. And potential investments into social and affordable housing, I would say, Harrison, are not the answer to the Australian housing market. The answer for Australians is that they can build and own their own homes, that they can purchase their own home. I don't think most Australians aspire to live in a home owned by the government. We have those things as a social safety net to protect the most vulnerable, but I've never said that the answer is the government owning more homes and providing them to Australians. The answer has to be empowering and enabling Australians to have a realistic prospect of owning their own home. And that's why everything I, housing minister, will continue to do as shadow housing minister is focused on helping particularly young Australians realise that dream of home ownership. And I think, sadly, this government seems to have waved the white flag in, I think, a really shocking accept that a lot of young people I speak to don't think they'll ever own a home, and my job, will be to convince them that they actually can and to put policies in place to make that more possible.
So, Michael, at the last election, your mob went forward proposing the super home buyer scheme where, if elected, you would offer first home buyers the opportunity to invest up to 40% or $50,000 of their super to buy a home. Do you guys still stand by that policy? Would you go to the next election still offering that?
Yeah, thanks, Dominic. That is a policy that I put forward before the last election. And yes, we've recommitted to that policy. We've recommitted to it for the next election. In fact, the opposition leader outlined it in his first budget in reply speech that we are absolutely committed to people accessing their own super to purchase a home. And then the one bit you left out was to then have to put that corresponding amount back into their super fund once they sold their first home. And we know in Australia, on average, Australians hold their first home for a period of 7 years. So a period to build up that equity and then to reinvest it into their super fund. Our position simply is if you are struggling on what is one of the most difficult hurdles to enter the housing market, that's the deposit hurdle. If you're struggling to get that deposit together, you should have the right and the choice to use your money to purchase your first home. It's not mandatory. If you don't want to do that, if you want to keep saving for years to try and get that deposit together and not touch your own super, well, that's your choice. But if you want to use your super, which is your money, for a period of time to put towards your deposit, get into that home, and then be required to responsibly reinvest it back into your super at the end, then you're using your money for what we think is the most important asset that most Australians own in their life. And we know the social benefits of owning your own home, the financial benefits of owning your own home. And we also know from every intergenerational report and every report into our retirement system, if you enter retirement owning your own home, your financial outcomes are infinitely better. So it's a policy we're very enthusiastic about. We'll be talking about it a lot between now in the next election. We think super's your money, and if you choose, it's not mandatory, but if you choose to use a portion of your super to put towards a deposit for a first home, that there's no better use of your super than that, in our opinion. And we're very proud to keep making that point every day between now and the election.
Michael, we'll move slightly now to some recent developments. As it's RBA day, they left the cash rate on hold at 4.1 for I think the third consecutive month. And this comes after a review into the RBA. So the Treasurer, Jim Chalmers, announced a review last year, and it's underway now. So have you had a chance to look at the RBA review? And what do you make of some of the new board appointments, and how will that affect your portfolio and housing?
Look, I did look at the review, and I mean, there were, I think, a number of very sensible sort of changes, and most of which I think we have supported. I mean, in the end, the RBA has been, and its independence has been, a success for our country. I know it's been of frustration from time to time, particularly when RBA governors' statements have not necessarily panned out. Predictive statements have not necessarily panned out. To date, we've been in broad agreement. Where we've disagreed with some of the, not necessarily the review, but some of the overtures from the government, is that potentially to have union representation on the board. We don't agree with that. I mean, I think this government entrenching union power, we've seen just in the last day or so with their industrial relations laws. We don't think that unions who represent less than 10% of Australian private sector workers should be put in the centre of our economy, which is what seemingly this Labor government wants to do. So I don't agree with that. I don't think there should be automatic union representation on the board. I think the broad policy intent of ensuring that target rate inflation and the labour market are treated to some extent evenly in the hierarchy of what monetary policy is trying to do is not a bad thing either. So, broadly speaking, pretty comfortable with where the review landed, and I would just say probably oppose some of the more extreme things that have come out since, particularly that entrenchment of union power in the RBA.
Michael Sukkar, we've covered a lot today. I'm afraid we're out of time though, but thanks so much for joining us here on the Savings Tip Jar.
Thanks, Dominic. Thanks, Harrison. I appreciate it.